You may show that you disagree with the invasion of Ukraine and show your support for the work that our team is doing by liking our video and pressing the super thanks button that is located below it. Since the beginning of the fighting on Ukrainian territory, the scent of fierce trench combat has permeated the entire battlefield. As the conflict in Ukraine, which has already witnessed millions of bullets, thousands of missiles, and artillery fire, continues, the capital city of Kyiv is presently carrying out simultaneous offensive operations on the east and south fronts of the country. This overwhelming fragrance of combat permeates the air. But if we take a look at the battlefield as it is right now, we can see that the Ukrainians are employing some really clever strategies, particularly on the flanks of the Bakhmut position. In response to the brilliant military strategies employed by Kyiv, the Russian forces have been preparing a big tank unit over the past few days in order to halt the Ukrainian advance, particularly to the south of Bakhmut, and to retake the trenches in these regions. These contemporary T-90 tanks were part of the Russian contingent. Russia sent 2 armored units to the village of Klushivka, which is located directly southwest of Bakhmut. Each of these units consisted of 3 heavy T-90 tanks, and between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock light infantry fighting vehicles were also there. At least a half dozen of the Kremlin's most advanced tanks, the T-90s, made their way into Klushivka, trying to gain control of strategically significant territory. After that, these Russian armored units pushed forward into the steep hills that are located between Klishivka and Andrevka. When 2 massive Russian armored battalions consisting of T-90s landed at the crucial heights between Klishivka and Andrivka, the Ukrainian armed forces responded with offensive operations. Although Ukrainian artillery units did for a time allow Russian tank brigades to march over the hills, Kyiv did so with the intention of achieving a particular goal by doing so. After the battle that broke out between the 2 Russian armored brigades that were marching from Klivchiv cut towards Andrivka and the Ukrainian artillery that was located in this area, this aim would become clear. Artillery forces from Ukraine did not commence fire right away because they were waiting for Russian T-90 tanks to arrive at this crucial area where they were going to combat with NATO standard howitzers. Therefore, the Ukrainian infantry held their position while waiting for the Russian tanks to arrive precisely in the kill zone. As was indicated earlier, this location was situated on one of the higher hills that are located between Kleshivka and Andrivka. A loud clash broke out between the Russian T-90 tanks and the howitzers used by the Ukrainian artillery as soon as the Russian tanks arrived within range of the howitzers. The Russian armored brigades were caught in the crossfire of the Ukrainian artillery before they even had a chance to figure out what was happening. It is likely that the Ukrainian artillery forces waited on a hill until approximately 10 T-90 tanks crossed the high ridge in the direction of Andrevka. To put it another way, Ukrainian soldiers surprised the Russian T-90 tanks with an ambush of unimaginable proportions. Caught in the crossfire of intense artillery fire, one after another, Russia's T-90 tanks, which are among their newest and most advanced, went up in flames and were destroyed. The circumstance, in which around 10 Russian T-90 tanks were destroyed by fire and rendered useless, was captured on drone cameras operated by Ukrainian forces. The footage obtained from the drone revealed that the Russian T-90 tanks that were trying to move from both directions in the conflict zone almost regretted entering the strategic sector that was located between Klushivka and Andrivka. In addition, declarations from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry were distributed, verifying the existence of this dramatic ambush operation. Officials from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense have declared, with reference to the footage captured by the drones, that offensive operations will continue both within Bakhmut and on the front lines surrounding this town. In fact, not long after the announcement was made by the Ministry of Defense, the offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces in these regions kept going at full pace. In the news from today, we learned of a remarkable offensive operation that Ukrainian forces were conducting in the direction of Bakhmut. Near Bakhmut, Ukrainian army Vampire drones were responsible for the destruction of a Russian munitions storage facility. At the same site, they were also successful in destroying a Russian armored battle vehicle. It was reported that the Code 9.2 unit of the Ukrainian army was successful in completing the mission of this spectacular attack. The film from the operation demonstrates that the Vampire drone successfully flew above Russian equipment located near Bakhmut and then returned to Ukrainian positions. After delivering their explosive payloads on Russian armored vehicles, these drones are spotted returning to Ukrainian positions to continue their mission. It is certainly commendable that the Vampire drones were able to carry out such an operation and do significant damage to Russian armored battle vehicles, as stated by the officials from the Ukrainian government. However, we really shouldn't be taken aback by the current circumstances. This is due to the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces have made significant strides in terms of their proficiency with unmanned aerial vehicles. This was evident in the drone attack that the Ukrainian Air Force orchestrated the other day in Crimea. As we explained to you in the video, the Ukrainians' offensive preparations are being carried out simultaneously on the eastern and southern front lines. The preparations for the Ukrainian forces' attack in the southern direction included the peninsula of Crimea as one of their stages. The most recent defense operation on the peninsula focused its attention on Sevastopol, which is one of the peninsula's biggest port cities, and Kerch, which is the peninsula's most significant connecting bridge. Today, the city of Sevastopol was the target of a tense aerial attack. Residents have stated that they can hear the sound of drones. Explosions of a violent kind were also heard in the city. Publications in the immediate area carried articles and reports about the attack. Eyewitness accounts suggest that drones were spotted in Sevastopol as well as in the area close to the Kerch bridge. After that, reportedly, Russian air defense systems were activated in the areas surrounding the two regions in question. Not long after that, an announcement came out stating that the Crimean bridge would be closed to civilian traffic once more. However, as is customary, the Crimean local authority did not provide a rationale for its decision to close the bridge. The Russian government has been working hard to fix the Crimean bridge, which has been damaged by the ongoing explosions in the area. However, the most recent strike in Sevastopol has slowed down the process of repairing the damage in Kerch. The Kerch bridge still has major damage despite the efforts that Russia has made over the course of the past 2 weeks, and the Russian authorities on the peninsula prefer to disguise some of the heavy damage that has been done to the bridge. But as a result of the onslaught that the Ukrainian military is waging in Crimea, we will, sooner or later, learn the truth about what is occurring at the Kerch bridge. The Russians are currently employing strategies that are nonsensical in an effort to thwart drone strikes on the bridge. According to the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate, Russia plans to establish a barrier in the Kerch Strait by sinking boats in order to shield the bridge from attack by Ukrainian surface drones. The Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate has received evidence that the Russians want to sink at least 6 ferries or vessels of a similar size for this reason. According to sources obtained by Ukrainian intelligence agencies, Russian forces are now in the process of creating a second ferry and will connect the 6 ferries to other forms of barriers. The question remains as to why the Russians attempted to take such a dangerous precautionary approach on the Kerch bridge. And what does this most recent occurrence on the bridge seem to imply? The previous 2 strikes that Ukraine carried out were effective, and they caused significant damage to the bridge's structure. The first assault took place in October and was carried out by a vehicle. The second assault took place on July 17 and involved 2 unmanned surface ships known as Sea Babies launching an assault on the bridge. This endeavor to safeguard the 19-kilometer-long bridge was a testament to the intensity of Moscow's actions and the intellectual crisis that has gripped the leadership of Russia's military-political establishment. One of Vladimir Putin's most poignant moments of desperation certainly occurred when the Russians demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice even their ferries in order to secure the bridge. In order to prevent the citizens of Crimea from becoming unduly alarmed, Russian authorities on the peninsula have asserted that the situation is under control, despite the fact that the bridge has sustained significant damage and that explosions and attacks on Crimea are still ongoing. In addition, the Russian authorities, as is their custom, have placed the blame for the recent attacks in Sevastopol and around Kerch on Ukraine. In fact, only a few hours before this incident, authorities in Ukraine had given some indication that something was about to take place on the peninsula. On the same day that an attack was carried out in Sevastopol, the head of military intelligence for Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, stated that residents of Crimea will have many restless nights ahead of them. In light of Budanov's words, the likelihood of Ukrainian forces being involved in the recent strikes in Crimea is most surely growing. This is due to the fact that Ukraine desires to retake control of Crimea in order to emerge victorious from this conflict. In a nutshell, during this past week, we saw Ukraine ambush the Russians on the eastern front lines, killing some of their most cutting-edge battle tanks, using drones in Crimea, and making noise in the Black Sea. You may show your appreciation by clicking the Super Thanks button below, as well as like and commenting on our video. In the most crucial battle of our century, which is being fought between Ukraine and Russia, a turning point has been reached on Zaporizhia's crucial front lines. The Ukrainian armed forces are making innovative military advances in the settlements located in the southern areas of the country. Most recently, Ukrainian troops drove Russian forces out of Eurozone and consolidated their position in the direction of Orikhiv, which is located to the southwest of Valika in Novosilka. The Ukrainians announced today that they have made an unexpected breakthrough in Robotyne, which is located south of Orikhiv. As a result of this success, Kiev's prospects on the southern front lines improved dramatically. At the same time, scores of Russian boats sailed to the bottom of the river in the direction of Kirsten-Dnipro. The following is today's most important news on the war. Robotyne was entirely freed thanks to the efforts of the armed forces of Ukraine. The settlement is entirely under the administration of the Ukrainian government. There has not been a formal announcement issued by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine as of yet. The drone film, which was obtained exclusively by the Kyiv Post, showed elements of the Ukrainian armed forces soldiers still battling and perhaps engaged in operations to clear the strategically significant village of Robotyne of the remnants of Russian soldiers. There is also a video that can be found online that shows a coaxial machine gun being fired from a Ukrainian tank against a Russian position that is less than 100 meters distant at Robotyne. An infantry fighting vehicle belonging to the Ukrainian armed forces provided backup for the tank by firing its own armaments, either a Pepe machine gun or an automatic cannon. These assaults were also corroborated by Ukrainian armored vehicles that were situated in the central and southern parts of Robotyne, as well as those that opened fire from the south. In addition, it seems as though the response of the Moscow ground forces to Robotyne was restricted to the use of small arms fire, and the video of the clashes did not show any movement of Russian troops or equipment. The video comes to an end with Russian anti-aircraft rocket cannon fire being fired on Ukrainian equipment by Russia. At the end of the video, Ukrainian military vehicles are shown rapidly fleeing from Russian positions while simultaneously detonating anti-missile self-defense grenades from within their vehicles. Therefore, it would appear that the Ukrainians had entirely liberated this settlement. On the other side, the Russians are currently in a state of panic as a direct result of the rescue of Robotyne. Previous to this, we have determined that Ukraine's strikes on Robotyne are of strategic importance. This is due to the fact that an offensive in this region may enable the defensive forces to begin crossing the most densely populated Russian minefields. The accomplishments of Ukraine in this sphere are likely evidence that supports this evaluation. It would appear that the Russians' efforts to weaken the Russian forces, which require a substantial amount of work, resources, and manpower in order to keep a position surrounding the village, are also intended by the Russians to weaken the Russian forces. As a result, it would appear that the Ukrainians' operations on the new front will be much easier these days. Along the Marfa-Pil-Dorozhnianka line in Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainian armed forces are now conducting preparations for a potential assault. According to military specialists, the Ukrainian armed forces have a chance of dealing another blow to the Russian defense there, despite the fact that the Russian defense has crossed the 100-kilometer mark along the southern front. It has been brought to our attention that the Ukrainian armed units are steadily examining the defense of the Russian army, with the knowledge that this location is home to the primary reserves as well as the units of the Russian armed forces that are closest to being ready for battle. Additionally, in the most recent geolocation footage, it is possible to observe Ukrainian soldiers penetrating a portion of the Russian defense south of Malaya, in the area known as Tokmachka. In other words, the Ukrainians are making significant progress toward the creation of an offensive network that will extend from Oreskhiv to Melitopol. The offensive of the Ukrainian defense forces to reach the shores of the Sea of Azov and break the land corridor between Russia and Crimea has the best chance of succeeding if it is launched from one of three directions: Melitopol, Berdyansk, or Vuhledar. In addition, Ukrainian partisan groups in Melitopol and other southern directions are on high alert in preparation to support these newly implemented offensive strategies in Kyiv. To put it another way, the Ukrainian forces defending the southern front lines have transitioned back into the rearing phase. However, in order to make the final decision before this period of preparation, it is necessary to determine the area in which the Russians are lacking. The military leadership of Ukraine, specifically General Zaluzhny, made this extremely important and mature decision. His estimations suggest that the Ukrainian armed forces will be able to assemble the required forces for a breakthrough sometime between the end of August and the beginning of September. In the meantime, the Russians exchanged negative evaluations of the advances made by the Ukrainians in Zaporizhzhia and other locations along the southern front. It was stated by Kremlin-affiliated pro-war blogger propagandists that Russian troops had evacuated from some positions near Verbovoy inside the bounds of flexible defense. This was most likely a response to the onslaught that the armed forces were waging in Tokmachka, which was in the southern region of Malaya. Because the Russian troops are also aware of the military preparations that the Ukrainians have been making, the moment has come for the Ukrainians to launch a new assault on these places. In other words, the time has come for the Ukrainians to launch a fresh assault on these areas. In fact, Russian soldiers have already begun their offensive in the city of Mariupol with the intention of turning the tide of the fight. An advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, named Petro Andrushchenko, stated that Russian occupation forces have begun to strengthen their defenses in the direction of Mikhail, close to the city. Andrushchenko was kind enough to supply me with this information. Additionally, the Russian military's aircraft capabilities are put to effective use in this region. Despite the fact that the Russian army was unsuccessful in its attempts to take retribution in the Kharkiv region, the preparedness preparations of the Russian military in the Kharkiv region are still ongoing. These plans are being carried out in the Kharkiv region. The main reason for the deterioration in the Kupiansk direction was Russian preparations to recover the territories in the Kharkiv region that were freed by the Ukrainian defense forces in the fall of 2022. These preparations were the source of the worsening in the direction of Kupiansk. After a little over a fortnight had elapsed, the Kupiansk became the target of the intensification that had been going on. The Ukrainian armed forces were causing the Russian armed forces a substantial amount of damage as they fought. Earlier, Ilya Yevlash, the commander of the eastern group of the Ukrainian armed forces, stated that the Russian army had dispatched large forces in the area of Lyman-Kupiansk. However, this was not sufficient to break through the defense line. Ilya Yevlash was referring to the fact that the Russian army had committed considerable forces in the area of Lyman-Kupiansk. According to him, the Ukrainian defense in this region is quite strong, and in order to take advantage of this, Kiev has resorted to a serious artillery strike in these areas. Even though it seems like there is less artillery fire and fighting in this sector of the front, this does not mean that the Russians have given up on their intentions. On the contrary, it just means that they have shifted their focus. The Russians are currently working on developing a new offensive strategy while also reforming their forces, which includes the addition of newly recruited soldiers to their ranks. It would appear that the Russians are not ready for a fresh breakthrough at this moment, either in terms of their morale, their motivation, or their supply of military weapons. This is the case in all three of these categories. Concerning this topic, Russian bloggers asserted that the Russian army, in particular the 20th United Arms Army and the 2nd United Arms Army that were operating in eastern Ukraine, lacked light vehicles, which prohibited them from deploying equipment and limited their efficiency. In particular, these bloggers pointed to the fact that the Russian army lacked light vehicles in the region of eastern Ukraine. The most current numbers also showed that Russian soldiers were compelled to register their personal cars with the Russian Ministry of Defense, after which the cars either vanished or were moved to another site. This was a requirement that had been in place since the most recent figures were compiled. On the other hand, one of the pieces of information revealed that Russian commanders regularly criticize their troops for committing minor breaches of administrative rules when they use their own personal automobiles. One of the pieces of information revealed this. As a consequence of this, they were under the misconception that they were fighting alongside their respective commanders. On the other hand, Russian propagandists claimed that the authorities did not provide the army with boats heading into the region of Kherson and that they have disregarded the many requests of bloggers on this topic since July 2. They said that the authorities have ignored the regular appeals of bloggers on this matter since July 2. They claimed that the authorities chose to disregard the calls, and that is why this incident occurred. After suffering from a lack of artillery guns, Russian forces continue to have difficulty performing counter-battery operations, according to pro-Russian lawmaker Oleksandr Khodorkovsky. Russian forces also continue to deal with challenges in conducting other types of operations. After Major General Ivan Popov was removed from his position as commander of the 58th United Arms Army, many individuals who are in favor of continuing the war in the Russian Federation have expressed concern that their forces do not possess adequate counter-battery capabilities. This is especially true in light of the fact that Major General Popov has recently been relieved of his duties. The ongoing complaints from members of the Russian armed services give the impression that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation is either unwilling or unable to address concerns regarding the constant lack of available equipment and poor levels of morale among service members. On the other hand, Russian forces are getting better at their tactics, and it's possible that they're learning from the mistakes they've made in the past. The extended conflict, which was partly caused by delays in the provision of Western assistance to Ukraine, did not appear to change much, which offered time for the Russian armed forces to perfect their tactics and gain vital experience. The prolonged conflict was partly caused by delays in the provision of Western assistance to Ukraine. You can express your gratitude to us by liking our video, writing a comment, and clicking the Super Thanks button located further down on this page. See you in the subsequent version of the work that we have been doing. The news that Yevgeny Prigozhin was slain is, as of right now, the most significant piece of information to emerge from the fighting in Ukraine. This photograph reveals that anti-aircraft shrapnel was buried within the wreckage of the Prigozhin aircraft. The debris belongs to the Prigozhin aircraft. This can only point to one conclusion, and the fact that Putin was the one to take his life is of critical importance. You will quickly comprehend the reason why. The shrapnel that was discovered in the bodies of passengers on board the Prigozhin's plane appears to be consistent with the Russian S-300 air defense missile, according to information that was leaked. However, you should be prepared for the Kremlin narrative to attribute the occurrence to a completely other cause. Meanwhile, the Russian war criminals have come up with a scenario that is even more ridiculous than usual this time. One of the pilots was a man named Tim Stepanov, who worked for the Prigozhins and had access to both the plane and the bomb because he was one of the pilots. Yevgeny Prigozhin was one of the 10 people who lost their lives when the plane they were traveling in crashed in the Tver area of Russia. The Russian Federal Air Transport Agency has stated that an investigation has been launched to determine what caused the incident that resulted in the deaths of all of the passengers and crew members who were aboard the aircraft. Vladimir Osechkin, who has contacts within the FSB, claims that it is quite likely that Vladimir Putin was the one who killed Sergei Prigozhin. Vladimir Osechkin's claims are based on the fact that Vladimir Osechkin has connections within the FSB. Keep an eye out for any additional details. Given how incompetent the Russian security agencies are at concealing secrets in the modern day, it is not out of the question that we will eventually uncover the truth. At the site of the plane crash, emergency personnel located the cell phone that belonged to Prigozhin. However, at this time, his remains have not been discovered, nor have they been identified. The bodies of the deceased were brought to the morgue so that they could be inspected once they were moved there from wherever they had been found. According to the information that was provided by the flight radar, the altitude of the business aircraft dropped by 2.4 kilometers in just 30 seconds, following which it maintained its altitude for a few seconds before resuming to fall and ultimately crashing. There is an extremely high level of confidence that Vladimir Putin was the one who gave the order to shoot down the airplane. According to what the Institute for the Study of War has published, it's possible that the Wagnerites intended for the air defense system to shoot down the aircraft as symbolic retaliation for the losses suffered by Russian aviation during the uprising. The fact that the Institute for the Study of War wrote about the incident supports this. Before the plane transporting Prigozhin's crashed, a witness reportedly heard 2 booms in the sky that sounded like missiles being fired. The Russian telegraph channel VCHO-GPU was the medium through which this information was transmitted. Gunshots caused 2 distinct explosions. I simply raised my head as soon as I heard the initial explosion, and then I spotted sparks flying in every direction. An eyewitness stated that after the initial boom, the airplane started to smoke, and the second time there was an explosion, it was definitely the engine that exploded. The eyewitness either observed it circling before it dropped or saw it crash after it had already been circling before it crashed. In an earlier video, it was mentioned that, despite the fact that each of us is on our way to hell, once we arrive there, we will be superior to anyone else who lives there. Wagner admirers in Russia are inconsolable, and Prigozhin has a special spot in the hearts of nationalists. They blamed Putin for the death of the hero, whom they believed was protecting them. Putin was guilty of the death. The truth of the matter is that he was not. Putin has an inaccurate idea of how the consequences of his actions will be played out. Putin has fabricated a sacrificial lamb for the situation. It is important for him to exercise caution about the unanticipated consequences. Do you remember the people of Rostov celebrating Prigozhin as he left after leading the coup that had just taken place? As a result of this, millions of people throughout the world who think Putin is weak in Ukraine have adored Prigozhin. These feelings were especially widespread among those serving in the armed forces of the United States. The persistent rumors of a second attempted coup have, quite reasonably, caused Putin to express his anxiety. After a trip to Kursk, Vladimir Putin has hastily made his way back to Moscow. The situation in Russia is dangerous on all fronts, including the political, economic, and military fronts. The situation in Russia is perilous. Nationalists in Russia, particularly those who held Prigozhin in high esteem, are the primary source of support for Putin. At any one moment, things may easily spiral out of control and become much worse than they already are. In his initial comments about the plane crash, Vladimir Putin conveyed his condolences to the families of those who perished, including Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the group's head. According to reports, the crash also claimed the lives of 9 other people, in addition to Richard Wagner. He went on to claim that Prigozhin was an incredibly accomplished businessman and that he had known him since the 1990s. He also mentioned that he had known him since the 1990s. He stated that Russia will look into what the investigators suggest, but that developing expertise on the matter will take some time. Please, idly sir, my family is from Peru and I was born there. In response to the question posed by Danny Guerrero and Tom Stutun Hagley, Saturnic Company, where in the hell did you come from? Lavrov once again demonstrates his exceptional proficiency in the art of diplomacy, and Lukashenko does the same with regard to the assurances of safety for Prigozhin. Both of these men have done an excellent job. So, all of this transpired by chance. It is likely that it might happen to anyone at any time. How is it even feasible to protect a person from harm in the event that they are involved in an accident? By sheer happenstance. It is essential to keep in mind that the Department of State of the United States of America issued an immediate evacuation order for American citizens who were residing in Belarus for the very first time. It's possible that U.S. intelligence agencies were made aware of the potential for the Wagner disturbance in Belarus as recently as 2 days ago, when they heard some chatter or were made aware of it themselves. And Zelensky reacts in the style that has become characteristic of him. You might remember that Ukraine recently gave a presentation on the subject of airplanes to a number of other countries. This in no way corresponds to the plan that we had in mind. The German Minister for Foreign Affairs, Baerbock, offered an explanation as to why Putin had Prigozhin assassinated. In Russia, it is not uncommon for deaths by suicide or murder to occur for reasons that cannot be explained. People are forced to commit suicide by jumping out of windows due to the fact that the only thing a dictatorship that was founded on violence is able to do is utilize violence. It's possible that a little more work is needed. I'm going to go ahead and make the assumption that the crew of the Roshi Maktis has anything to comment on regarding this white substance. The information that was gathered from Napalm Gherkin will be the next to be disposed of as it is taken from the detention center to the Avdizak court. A labor migrant from Tajikistan was driving the Kamaz truck that collided with him, causing him to receive injuries. The driver of the Kamaz truck was from Tajikistan. Who else in Russia, other than Prigozhin, is known to command their very own private army? There is a possibility that the present moment is the optimal time to start looking into life insurance policies. And Ukrainians did not squander the opportunity to indulge in some amusing trolling by wasting any time. In the end, the Russian air defense personnel are successful in hitting their target in the neighborhood of the capital city of Moscow. Igor Konashenkov, a spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Defense, reported that in the last day, Russian air defense had shot down 219 Ukrainian drones, 88 NATO spy balloons, 14 B-52 Stratofortresses, 3 Millennium Falcons, and 1 Yevgeny Prigozhin. He also mentioned that the Russian air defense had also destroyed 14 B-52 Stratofortresses. Now that a sledgehammer has been brought to the monument for the Prigozhins, please send us the funniest meme you can think of that is related to Prigozhin. One of the images that has come to be identified with Russia and the Russian-influenced world is that of a bloodied sledgehammer being driven through the tops of people's skulls. We appreciate you viewing, and if you liked what you saw, we would ask that you kindly consider subscribing to our channel.